There is a moment in every great confrontation between powers when whoever took the initiative discovers that the action they executed to project strength has instead revealed the exact coordinates of their own vulnerability. The United States imposed a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz to demonstrate decisive military resolve. What the blockade has actually demonstrated with a clarity that no adversary could have engineered more effectively is precisely where American strategic power ends and where Chinese strategic power begins. A tanker linked to China, the Star Rich, transited through the Strait of Hormuz after the American blockade was already in effect. It was not stopped, it was not turned away, it was not boarded. It passed through the strait even though the vessel already had prior sanctions from the United States, even though the most powerful naval force in the history of humanity was positioned in those waters to enforce American policy, a single tanker. But you have to understand what that single ship represents. It is not a story about maritime transport. It is a deliberately chosen, deliberately executed and deliberately published signal that tells every government in the world watching this confrontation exactly how much the American blockade of the most critical energy corridor on the planet is worth when China decides it will not comply with it. At the same time, Xi Jinping is in the middle of a series of high-level diplomatic engagements that, taken together, constitute the most significant Chinese diplomatic offensive since the beginning of the conflict. The United Arab Emirates, Spain, Russia, 3 meetings that span the Gulf, Europe, and the Eurasian strategic axis. 3 meetings that together are building something, not simply commenting on American policy, not simply adopting diplomatic positions, but something structural, something that is being built to last beyond this crisis and to define the order that will come after it. Tonight we are going to do what no conventional analysis has yet attempted, to read China's movements in the Hormuz confrontation not as a reactive diplomatic commentary, but as the active construction of a new global order in real time. We are going to explain exactly what the passage of the Star Rich means for the reality of American blockade enforcement. We are going to map out what Xi's 3 simultaneous diplomatic engagements are building, and we are going to answer the question that every honest strategic analyst must answer tonight. Has the United States just handed China the greatest strategic gift of the 21st century? This is the architecture of what we are going to analyze. First, the passage of the Star Rich and what it reveals about the reality of blockade enforcement. A blockade that cannot be enforced against a sanctioned vessel linked to the second largest economy in the world is not a blockade, it is a declaration. We are going to explain the difference between those 2 things with the precision it demands. Second, Xi's diplomatic triangle, United Arab Emirates, Spain, Russia. These 3 engagements are not random. They are the deliberate construction of a coalition architecture that spans Gulf energy, European legitimacy and Eurasian military weight, and that together constitutes a challenge to American unilateralism that is broader and more enduring than Washington anticipated when it imposed the blockade. We are going to map out what is being built. Third, the statement from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its intended audience. For Beijing to call the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible is not filler diplomatic boilerplate. Every word of that formulation was chosen with precision for a specific audience. We are going to identify who that audience is and what China is asking them to do. Fourth, the energy economics of the blockade. The Strait of Hormuz is not a military problem that accidentally has economic implications. It is an economic reality that military force cannot simply ignore. We are going to analyze exactly which economies are being damaged by the blockade and why the pattern of that damage generates political pressure that works against American strategic objectives. Fifth, where does the confrontation between the United States and China over Hormuz go from here? This is no longer a conflict between the United States and Iran with Chinese commentary on the sidelines. China has become a directly interested actor in the resolution of the Hormuz question. We are going to evaluate what that means for each trajectory this conflict can take. Now let us begin with the Star Rich, because the Star Rich is the story within the story that everyone else is missing. This vessel was already on a list, it was already designated, it was already subject to all the legal and administrative architecture that American financial and maritime enforcement deploys to prevent vessels linked to sanctioned entities from operating freely in international trade. The United States knew about this ship, had taken formal action regarding this ship, and then imposed a blockade on the waterway that this ship subsequently transited and the ship passed. There are multiple possible explanations for this, and military analysts will debate the details. Perhaps the ship's passage occurred in a gap in naval coverage. Perhaps the enforcement decision was made at a command level that did not want to create a direct naval incident between the United States and China over a single tanker. Perhaps the rules of engagement for the blockade contain exceptions or thresholds that a single commercial vessel does not reach. All these explanations may contain elements of truth, but this is what none of those explanations changes. The image the world observed was that of a sanctioned tanker linked to China moving through an American blockade. The perception in the capitals of all the countries watching this confrontation is that the blockade has a limit, that limit is China, and that China has just demonstrated that publicly, deliberately, and without suffering any consequences for having done so. In the strategic communication environment of great power competition, perception frequently matters more than operational reality. China did not need to defeat the American Navy in the Strait of Hormuz to establish this point. It needed a tanker, a transit, and a news cycle. It has all three. Xi's diplomatic engagements this week are individually significant and collectively extraordinary. Let me analyze each one before explaining what they build together. The meeting with the United Arab Emirates. The president of the Emirates received Xi Jinping while the American blockade of the strait, through which Emirati energy exports must pass, was active and generating economic disruptions. The message China is sending to Abu Dhabi in this meeting is specific and transcendent. We see your vulnerability. We oppose the action that is creating it. And we are positioning ourselves as the relationship that protects your economic interests from here on out. The Emirates are not a hostile actor toward the United States. They host American military facilities. They have deep financial integration with the American global economic system. But it is also a country whose economic survival depends on unhindered access to global energy markets through the Strait of Hormuz. That message, delivered from Beijing with the credibility of the Chinese economic relations on which most of those governments depend, lands differently than it would coming from any other source. The intended audience for this statement is not Washington. Washington is not going to change its blockade policy because Beijing called it irresponsible. The intended audience is every government between Washington and Beijing that has not yet decided which side of this confrontation it is on. China is presenting to that audience the argument that the American side is the side of instability, illegality, and economic damage to the interests of the developing world, that the Chinese side is the side of international law, Diplomatic resolution and protected energy access. That argument is not without merit, and its reception in the capitals of Asia, Africa, and Latin America will shape the strategic landscape of this conflict for years after the immediate military confrontation has been resolved. The energy economics of the Hormuz blockade deserves the detailed treatment it is not receiving in mainstream coverage, because the pattern of economic damage from this blockade is actively undermining the political coalition that American military operations require. The United States does not depend significantly on petroleum imports from the Persian Gulf. American energy production has restructured the country's import dependence over the past 15 years to a degree that isolates the American economy from Gulf supply disruptions to an extent that no previous administration had enjoyed. When Washington imposes a blockade on Hormuz, the American economy does not immediately feel the consequences in a way that generates domestic political pressure against the blockade. The economies that immediately feel those consequences are India, Japan, South Korea, and the European states. These are American allies. These are the governments whose political support underpins the legitimacy of American military operations. These are the countries whose populations begin to experience energy price shocks just weeks after a sustained disruption of Hormuz, shocks that translate into inflation, transportation costs, manufacturing input costs, heating costs for ordinary citizens who have no strategic interest in the conflict with Iran and no tolerance for bearing its economic burden. Political leaders in those countries are now managing a genuinely impossible situation. They cannot publicly break with Washington without consequences for their security relationships, but they also cannot absorb sustained energy price shocks without consequences for their domestic political survival. The pressure those leaders are exerting through private channels on Washington, pressure that will never appear in a press release, but that shapes every operational decision American military forces make in the Gulf, is already significant and is growing. China completely understands this pressure structure. The Chinese diplomatic offensive is designed in part to give those governments, India, Japan, South Korea, the European states, political cover to push back against the blockade without formally breaking alliance relationships. When the Prime Minister of Spain visits Beijing and endorses international law over American unilateralism, he is not just speaking for Spain, he is giving every other allied government a signal that public dissent regarding American policy carries legitimacy and European company. Now let us go to where this confrontation is really heading, because the United States and China dimension of the Hormuz crisis is no longer a peripheral complication of the conflict with Iran, it is the central strategic story of the next phase of the conflict. China has become a directly interested actor. The passage of the Star-Rich, the diplomatic offensive, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement, the coordination with Lavrov. These are not the actions of one country commenting on another's conflict. They are the actions of a country that has decided that the outcome of the Hormuz confrontation is important enough to its strategic interests to be willing to actively shape that outcome, to accept the American anger that this activism produces, and to absorb the costs Washington imposes for Chinese non-compliance with the blockade. That decision, the fact that China has crossed from commentator to directly interested actor, completely changes the strategic mathematics of the blockade. The American planners who designed the blockade calculated the cost of Iranian resistance, the cost of Gulf state pressure, the cost of allied economic unrest. Three trajectories, here they are. The first trajectory, the blockade holds, but at accelerating costs. American naval forces maintain physical control of the strait. Chinese tankers attempting transit face increasing enforcement pressure that Beijing must decide whether to escalate or absorb. The diplomatic cost of the blockade to American alliances accumulates. European political leaders face growing domestic pressure. Gulf states quietly communicate their displeasure through private channels. The blockade achieves its stated purpose of economic pressure on Iran, but at a cost to American strategic relationships that multiplies with every week of continuation.